Hello, and welcome to this conversation with Luís Bettencourt on the theme of urban scaling. Urban scaling is simply the study of how the properties of a city change with size. It allows us to conceptualize cities as systems, as networks of interacting components that are constrained by the physical space that they're in, and how this leads to the various kinds of urban outcomes that we are familiar with, whether this be innovation in cities or income in cities or crime in cities, all the various phenomenon that define the urban experience. So in this conversation, Luis will help us make sense of the kinds of patterns that are observed in cities around the world, and more importantly, we will delve into the question of why do we see those patterns. This will therefore help us make sense of why urban scaling is a scientific framework, how it helps us build a science of cities. Luis will also discuss in this conversation the importance of history, contingency in the patterns that emerge over time, and we will spend some time briefly discussing the policy implications of the work that has emerged out of urban scaling. Luis is currently a professor at the University of Chicago and for a long time has also been affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Luis. Welcome. Thanks so much for taking the time today. So let's get right into this. I was really hoping that we could talk to you about your work on cities. You're sort of one of the pioneers on developing a science of cities. But before we actually get into that, I just wanted to take a moment and talk about, this notion of cities as organisms, right? It's quite an old notion, and it has usually been quite metaphorical in the sense that, the way we speak about cities, we speak about neighborhoods being hearts of cities, we speak about the arteries and, the lungs of the city, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, in a metaphorical sense, it's quite an old, way to think about the city. And in areas like urban planning and architecture, people have taken that sort of metaphor. People like Le Corbusier, for instance, in the work he did in Chandigarh and Brasilia, probably. He took those ideas of, organisms, and, I think he writes about the administrative head of a city and the residential industrial bowels, etc. So I just wanted to start off with, getting your sense of, why is this such a strong metaphor? Why do you think it's such a strong metaphor? And did that influence, the way you thought about cities at all?
Yes. So, hello. It's great to be here. Hello from Chicago. You can kind of see I'm in a different city. So it's wonderful to be a little bit in Madras as well, and Chennai. Yes. So cities and complex systems. So cities, in some sense, are the ultimate complex system. I joke sometimes that it has all the other complex systems in them. They have organisms and brains and ecosystems and engineered systems and everything. And so it's a great place to think about various complex systems, analogies, and also differences. On the issue of the organism, I think the organism is kind of at the level it's been used on cities. We don't always mean, strictly speaking, a biological organism. But sorry, that's my wife. But we mean something. So sometimes a biological organism, that metaphor is also of the brain, particularly now with smart cities and things that are more like the internet and so on. And a few other ideas. So the organism is kind of something that's tangible. We kind of have a sense of our own bodies and the bodies of other biological things and anatomy and so on. But I think what's important, so and these analogies go back in writing, at least in the West, since the Greeks. Like, Aristotle's talking about the polis, the city, which for them was also the state, in terms of things like ant colonies and beehives and things like this, which again is a different kind of organism that in biology would describe as sort of a superorganism, again, an organism of organisms. So the city is a little bit more like that, in that the characteristics of organisms is that they're composed of many different like entities, like people. But then they also have structure. So they have, a network structure, like, as you said, a vascular system that moves things around. In cities, they're mostly like road networks and subways and things like that. We'll get to that in a moment because that's actually consequential. And then there's what's interesting is that there's a lot of sort of division of labor, right? There are different parts, even though the units are to begin with similar, they end up doing different things, right? So in the city, there are different professions, there are different places dedicated to different functions and so on. And in the body, you may have different organs and so on. So that all that is true structurally. And so that was quite compelling coming in to test the hypothesis. And as you know, the work on sort of my work and the work on sort of the modern science of cities, a lot of it started at the Santa Fe Institute, and our colleague Jeffrey West was just studying, had just come from the work on biological scaling with his colleagues Brian Enquist and others. He was basically looking at the vascular system as sort of the energy constraint on the body that had certain consequences. And so we in our discussions were also about that, whether that analogy, which was specific and had a scaling law associated with it, actually applied to cities. So when you actually look at it and start looking at the properties of cities, which is actually the work of doing the science, right? Then what we started concluding was that actually cities had different properties than, say, organisms. So one of the things that is consequential, just to go back to the various networks and parts, is the following. In organisms or vascular systems, another analogy was actually river networks. You kind of imagine sort of the vascular system of a river in a landscape. They're understood as systems of flow that reach every point, so every cell in the body, every bit on land, but that also are essentially trying to be efficient from the point of view of energy. So they're trying to spend as little energy as possible. And that already was a little suspicious in a city because cities are kind of very energy intense. And what happens to those systems is that they're kind of centralized. So, for example, in your body, every cell kind of is connected to the network, but then the blood flow, say, goes all the way, is collected, goes all the way through the heart and then lungs, and then comes back to each cell. So in some sense, if you were a city, in order to talk to your neighbor, you'd have to go, if it's New York, you have to go through Times Square, right? Which is kind of crazy when you say that. So in a city, the network actually looks similar, but works differently. So the network allows all kinds of local interactions to happen. Like you can go and visit your neighbor without having to go through a more central part of the city and so on. And so the network is so-called decentralized. And this means because the network studied in biology had been analyzed for the least energy dissipation possible, that means that the networks of cities, from this point of how they function, are not using the minimal energy necessary. So that was already like interesting. And so the consequence is that they're doing something different. So in an organism, each cell doesn't need to talk to each cell. The brain is actually an exception. It's a little different, but in most cases, the cells interact just globally through blood flow and hormones and so on. Whereas in a city, the whole point is that a person has agency, unique agency, and can talk to other people and create their own associations and firms and friendships and so on. And so that is essentially the nature of the city, are social interactions between people that can be differentiated and that then essentially leads to the dynamics of cities as a place where these interactions can be expressed in many ways, economically, politically, other social mechanisms and so on. So that's the big difference, is that cities are much more decentralized. People have agency, and the connections are mostly local, though they go across scales, of course. And that means that cities are not really optimized like biological organisms to save energy and to be efficient. They actually are quite energy intensive, but they create all the products of socioeconomic interactions, which is what's special about humans, is that our cooperation, our interactions can create all kinds of products, right, that have changed the world. So in some sense, cities are a little bit like an organism structurally, but not in the way they operate. And they open up these possibilities of networked systems, and we can get to those because there are also analogies there, but they're different from organisms, to produce innovation, economic growth, social organization, differentiation, all kinds of things that are more uniquely human and they're much faster at producing change.
Right. So, actually, that takes us nicely to the entrance into your work specifically, which is really to say, you took this metaphor, these ideas of networks, interactions, and then you applied them to cities in a way that, really had not been done before. So really, if you can talk a little bit about what were you expecting to see? I know you mentioned that Jeffrey West had been working on, biological networks, metabolism, etc. But, when you started working on cities using that kind of a framework, what were you expecting to see? And really, what were the patterns that you observed?
Yeah, so we were very much guided by data because again, in cities, we live in cities. We have a sense, most people have a sense that understand them, at least intuitively. And there've also been all these metaphors around. So there's a lot of kind of baggage coming in. And I think what was different when, in the last 20 years or so, is that we have all this data coming from all kinds of parts of the world that allows us to analyze cities much more rigorously in terms of the evidence, but also compare them. So we can, as you know, we're working to compare the cities of India, the cities of the United States, the cities of Africa, the cities of China. And so we can actually see many different kinds of cities. And usually and they have different properties. Some are more industrial, some are less, some, are more developed, some less, et cetera. Some are bigger. And so part of the question was always the question in science, right? If you have sort of a science mindset, is what is essential? What is it that's common to all cities? And then you can go, of course, there are lots of things that are very particular that make each city being different from everything else, just like for us, right? A person is different from other people, but we have medicine and physiology and so on. So that was sort of that question. Yeah. First, I want to explain very briefly what a scaling law is, because we've been kicking around this concept. So scaling law is something, I think if the audience is familiar with mathematics or even with engineering, in engineering, it's a very common thing because we often, use similarity theory or something to build models of a boat or a building or whatever that we then want to scale up and create the real thing. And so, and most of these, as well as in many models of physics and chemistry and so on, have this built-in similarity in them. So similarity means that there's a relationship between variables. Usually one of the variables is measuring the size of the object, which for a city, we typically use population, but we could use area and other things. So it gives you a sense of the size of the city. And then on the other side, you have the property that you want to measure, what's GDP or crime rates or number of roads or whatever, or area of roads or something. So basically, it's a simple relationship between those variables. What is interesting is that a scaling relationship, the reason it's called scaling, it's a simple, mathematically, it's a power law relationship. So it's something like GDP is equal to base GDP times population to some exponent. And this exponent is this number that's larger than 1 in this case, because then it increases faster than population. And then, of course, there are variations from city to city also that make this a statistical quantity. But the fact that it's like a power law has a very important consequence, which these are also called scaling variant laws or scaling variant relations. It means that there's no specific scale, no size of the city or no size of the object that we're looking at that's special. It's basically a relationship that relates what a city is at a certain population scale to what it is at a different population scale. So it's a relative law, if you will. It's not an absolute law that it becomes a city after it has 1 million people. It means that a city of 1 million people has a relationship to a city of 100,000 people and of 10 million people in terms of the proportionalities. So these exponents essentially just measure, as we used in language, by what percentage the variable of interest is changing relative to the variable of size. So when you double the size of the city, this happens or that happens in percent. So that's what that means. And that kind of is very consequential because it says something that's very important and powerful and surprising, I think, which is that cities don't have a particular size. Think about that. So you could have a city that's quite small. Obviously at some point you have one person and no longer a city, but it can be quite small. And then it could be in principle, as long as the conditions of the theory, which of course at some point breaks down, but as long as the balance, the costs and benefits and so on would keep being satisfied, you could create a city of any size, any population size. So that means that, at the moment, the largest city in the world still is Tokyo, which is about 40 million people, which is quite a lot. But the cities of India by mid-century are supposed to get bigger than that. And then the cities of West Africa in particular, something like Lagos, by maybe towards the end of the century, supposed to get to about the projections of something like 80 million people, so double the size of Tokyo. So these laws tell you that that's okay. You can just actually predict what that's going to look like in terms of all these properties and how these cities are going to be so fast and maybe so congested, but also how they need to go three-dimensional and how you expect to have certain rates of innovation, how you expect the GDP to be, everything. Right? So that's amazing. It doesn't say, oh no, if it's bigger than 40 million, I just don't know. It just tells you in principle, as long as these properties that are necessary for a city to persist, I can tell you a lot about this. But then it also allows you to say a lot about small places. We started looking at things like crime rates, or my colleague Jose Lobo and Deborah Strumsky had a lot of data on innovation, particularly related to patents, that gave us a sense of rates of innovation. So all these are rates, actually. So they're things per unit time, usually measure, GDP as number of money transactions consumed or produced over a year, right? So there's kind of a speed, a rate of something happening. So all these things that socioeconomic had this character that was very different from organisms, in biology. And they all accelerated as cities got larger. So what we saw was that there are countries that are richer, countries that are poorer. But if you compare cities within the same country, then you find that larger cities have, for example, a higher GDP per capita. New York has a higher GDP per capita than Chicago. Chicago has more than a smaller city, and so on. And so there was kind of this acceleration of the production of almost anything that we measure that was socioeconomic. So it was not narrowly economic, not narrowly, epidemics and other, not narrowly to do with other, with crime or innovation. It was just all these quantities had the same signature. They basically increased on a per capita basis. If you double the size of a city, you get sort of 16% more per capita. So that was kind of weird. And it smelled to us like a general result, a general property. So that begged the question, essentially an explanation. And the other part is that everything physical about the city, going back to the road networks and the buildings and so on, they had the opposite character, curiously. So for example, if you measure the area of roads in cities in the same way, and you just say, how does it increase with city size? Then you find that it increases slower than population. And so basically, it decreases on a per capita basis by about those same 16%. So that was curious. So what that means is that cities are getting a little denser as they get bigger. So more people use the same amount of road and a little bit the same building. We can get to buildings because they also get taller, which is interesting. But then all the stuff that has of socioeconomic rates, which we started interpreting basically as the products of socioeconomic interactions. So we needed to have an interaction theory. Increase and speed up. So the idea we started having, I was coming to this actually from studying several data sets and ideas of innovation and networks. So networks also at the same time we're doing this work became a big tool for many analysis of many complex systems. So we started seeing that there were two kinds of networks actually that we needed to distinguish. One is the physical network of roads and transportation things and cables and so on, which had this characteristic of densifying. That felt a little bit more, the numbers were not the same, but they found this other network of socioeconomic interactions had to live on the physical space and had a different character. And that was really what led us to seek a different kind of explanation that explained these accelerations and therefore potentially increases in energy expenditures. And so that became basic. So the analogy is very simple. There were many examples once you ask the question that way. But what's interesting about networks is that the number of interactions typically grow faster than the number of elements. If you do a little bit of math, you know that even in the simplest network, it would go like n is the number of people here squared. So that means that on a per capita basis increases proportional to people. So that would give you a window into what can happen in a network. So the links now are like the measures of GDP, if these links are economic, or the measures of a disease transmission or of a crime or something. So it's the links that we're counting. So that was the idea. And then you had to put this together and get the numbers right. And the idea was that it's essentially the physical network that's providing the stage, the container, which is a network. It's not like a vessel. for the socioeconomic interactions to happen. So you can have these two effects actually have the same effect. You have a densification in a very structured space with certain characteristics of cost, and then you have an acceleration of socioeconomic interactions that it sustains that basically drives all the socioeconomic rate. So you end up with a city as kind of a theory of these networks, where one network is inside the other and conditions the cost benefit of the other. And then the whole thing works and self-consistent. And what that means is that cities now are a different kind of thing. So we can go there if you want.
Right. So I just wanted to, pause there for a second because I mean, the idea of looking at these metrics to understand cities is not new at all, right? Whether it's GDP or crime. I mean, we've been looking at these statistics for, for 50, 100 years now to understand cities. And I guess one of the things that we sort of, I guess, naturally do is presume that, larger cities will, for instance, have more crime than smaller cities because of greater population. And I think, in fact, that we tend to assume what you would call a linear scaling, is that a doubling of population, for instance, would lead to a doubling of crime or a doubling of income. That almost seems to be an intuitive, instinctual thing that we do. Now, what this work is suggesting is that, well, there's no reason to think that way. There's actually, because empirically, first of all, what you said was we observe, three different kinds of, scaling relationships, right? So for instance, I think you mentioned that for infrastructure like roads, etc., you saw that, for a doubling of population, you didn't need to double the length of roads. You had to only grow it by about 85, 84%. And similarly for income, I think you said that, for a doubling of population, income not just doubles, but actually grows by, 16% more than that, right? So I think on the one hand, it's really interesting to sort of get a sense that our intuition of what to expect itself fundamentally changes now, because we were initially working with something that was innate, we didn't think about it. But I think, and that's, I think, the point of doing science, is that, you then understand why or what to expect in some sense, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the point, is that you find, that's why we all do science, at least that's why I do it, is that I want the discovery, the surprises, right? You want to find something new. And in cities, of course, because I think people would feel this, right? So there are a lot of things that are intuitive. Once you put this idea on, right, and you try it on, you go to a larger city and it feels fast and full of people, right? There's sort of the sense of speed, of opportunity, but also of congestion all at the same time. And one line of work we've been pursuing more recently is, and this again has roots in old, 100-year-old sociology, when people are looking at, and psychology looking at the behaviors of people in cities. At the time was the Industrial Revolution in the West, and so people thought that cities were very pathological environments from the point of view of mental health and so on. But, that's not always, again, observed. It depends on the quantity and so on. I don't want to be glib, but the point is that once people are essentially social beings, are the most important aspects of our environments are other people. That's the kind of creature we are. And so when you put them surrounded by other people in these environments, people's behaviors change, their cognition changes, their attitude towards the future changes. So that's fascinating and actually can be measured. So in some sense, we become part of these networks and we work differently. And so this is what cities allow. So for example, we did a recent study, we had the data on this and so on, we're pursuing similar things, but on depression. Depression is known to be as a mental health. So there was ideas that maybe these things would get worse as cities get larger. But depression, actually, one of the factors that's protective is people having more interactions with other people. And so the prediction here is that larger cities actually would be better for that, even though these contacts may not be very friendly all the time, but just they're stimulating. And so indeed, certainly for cities in the United States, that's what we find, that basically larger cities, the rates of depression are lower. Now, there are many things to study along the line of refining that picture. It's known, again, that people that are in positions of poverty or isolation and so on within a city suffer differently. So that can be done. But basically on the general population, that seems to be a protective effect. And there are rates that can relate to that of suicide and so on that tend to be, certainly in the US, more rural. But anyway, so things like that, there's speed of behavior, there are things like your tolerance to difference, to different people. You see even sort of in the way people vote. People tend to be more pro-social and pro-government and tolerant of people from different races and castes and origins, because it's the reality, it's what we experience in everyday life. Doesn't mean that people necessarily like it, depends how you ask the question. Yeah. But in general, there's a lot more tolerance and acceptance that that's the way the world should be. So it's kind of fascinating. And these are things that are not just like the infrastructure and the roads, or sort of the GDP as an abstract thing, but to do really with how people live and approach life and behave. So I think that that's kind of very important. But the part then that I think connects us to another part of science, particularly this idea of cultural evolution and sort of a larger view of what humans are and what our societies are, is that in some sense, if our superpower as a species is hypersociality, the ability to interact and cooperate is really with people who are not our relatives, then you need an environment so that becomes possible and that becomes feasible at some level. Not to say cities are easy, but it becomes feasible. And then in some sense, that's what cities are. They're sort of a cultural adaptation to allow large-scale sociality, which for humans has most of the time great benefits. So that's what cities are. We call it sort of, in one of my papers, I call it sort of a social reactor. It's just it's kind of a niche, an environment that allows people to create larger and larger co-located societies on daily interactions, and that has all the possibilities that you see in any large city. Creates amazing things we've never seen before, from the buildings to the cultural products, the fashion to everything else.
Right. So before we go further, and I want to sort of touch a little bit more on these notions of history and culture, because we know that these are important things. How does that mesh with what we are finding from the science? But before we do that, I want to touch upon something that's more fundamental, the definition of a city. Right now, in physics, for instance, definitions of terms are fairly, you sort of nail down the definition and then build on it. Now, when we sort of, want to understand cities as systems, a fundamental problem is how do you define a city, right? Now, there have been papers written on this issue to say that, scaling relationships, do they actually exist depending on how you define cities? Is it just an artifact of definition? That if I change the definition of a city, because at the end of the day, the way, the United States defines a city might be very different from the way Portugal defines a city, very different from the way India defines a city. And we have seen all this, right? We have seen these definitions. So how would you sort of, respond to that? That definition is important, of course, but how do we sort of understand the salience of these scaling relationships, given that, sometimes we're not able to find consistent definitions?
Right. I'm going to answer that, but we should also get back to say what the scaling relation is, so that we're all on the same page. But let me try to answer that. So my position is the same position. You mentioned physics. In physics, I think I'm paraphrasing Einstein or somebody like that said that the definition is not primary. The theory is primary. So the theory is essentially the explanation of what we think a city is. And we put it in math and derive consequences, but basically it's the idea of what a city is as a mechanism, as a process. And then the definition follows from the theory. You don't start with definition and derive a theory. That never works in any field. And so I think that's the problem that, across the community we're having with cities, because there have been a lot of administrative and other definitions by geographers and so on without theory, basically, or without explicit theory. And so when we came along and came up with these ideas that are sort of supported by all this evidence from around the world and across time and so on, the theory essentially is city as a co-localized network over space. So it's really about the interactions of people over, at a certain temporal frequency on a daily basis, basically, over these built spaces. And so in order to do that, you need to come up with a definition that makes sense. So the problem, so that then takes us to a practical problem about what's the extent of the city. For very old cities, before essentially there were cars, that was easy because it was just people could only walk so far. within a radius of a few miles, that was the city. So we actually did that in history, went back and saw that works perfectly well. But then it's called Ortman and other people who are archaeologists. But then, once you come to modern cities, because you have modern transportation, so there's this rule of thumb that comes from geography that the extent of the city is about an hour travel. It can be more. You see that in cities that are developing where people spend more time, but 1-2 hours, something like this. So, but 1 or 2 hours depends, the distance and what it includes varies tremendously depending on whether you use a car or you use a fast train or subway or whether we walk, right? So if you walk, it's easy. But otherwise, you can cover easily, 100 miles or something like this, or in other units over 150 kilometers or something, like in 2 hours if you're not unimpeded, right? So that's a huge distance, right? And that means that a city does not have to exist as a compact, dense core, but starts having all kinds of sort of surrounding suburbs that can exist at lower densities, as happens in the US and starting to happen in India, and even satellite towns and so on, that if they're well connected with trains or subways or whatever, that becomes possible. So that's the problem. This problem actually was understood in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, at the time when after the war, the United States was building all the highway systems and people were buying cars. And because the census of the United States realized that they had been measuring metropolitan expansion since the beginning of the 20th century, and they found that they needed to extend the definition to include essentially all the interaction population with cars. So they came up with this idea of metropolitan areas, which are basically commute zones. So if you start doing now the commute zone, these are all the people that are interacting on a daily basis. And that's the definition we've always used. And that's what economists use and so on. It's this functional definition of the city. So that's what's used because that's the network definition. Now, the operationalizing that is not always very simple because you need to have commuting flows. Now we can do that with cell phones and so on. But it begs that question. We don't always have that data when we look at a map and just look at densities. For example, if there's a city nearby, is that connected or not? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes to some extent. So for the United States, these definitions have existed since the 1960s, first with surveys and now with better methods. So that was where we started with the data. The data was better, and that gives you all these scaling relations that are nonlinear that we described. And then, these definitions were also constructed, for example, for Europe, and in a recent effort, the last 10 or 20 years, because again, they have the same problem. The cities, even though they're older, they're expanding. And so you find the same, once you use these definitions, you find the same thing and so on. What people have done in geography is that, for example, and now, as you know, we're trying to create definitions like that in China and India and other places where the data is just coming together now. We'll be able to do a better job in the future and just test this empirically. But also this, presumably, as I think we were talking about, the cities of even in India are also expanding because similar processes are happening now, building transportation infrastructure, people are a little wealthier, they can afford things. So that will result sort of in an expansion of cities that depends also on policies of urban planning and so on. But what people have done in geography is that they tested other definitions that make sense for other reasons, but they are not functional definitions of cities. So for example, what people like to do a lot is to impose a density threshold. You look at maps of population without motion now, and you just say, well, a city has to have a density above a certain number of people per square mile or per square kilometer. Really? I mean, there are all these suburbs out there. They're very low density where people commute. But if you do that, if you just look at the math, right? If the density is a certain number, and particularly if you're looking at small towns, then the density doesn't increase a lot to inside that. And so if the density is fixed, then the area and the population are proportional to each other. So the scaling exponent, this number that we try to measure, the 16%, is 1. So now it's proportional. So in those cases, you kind of put in a bias on the estimate of this. And I think this is what happened in many studies. And it makes sense from what you did. You just have to understand what you did and whether it's right or wrong. But again, that is not respectful of a definition which is based on interactions primarily. So I think, the empirical studies continue and so on. But the whole point is that if you have an idea of what a city is as an interaction network, and you have a definition that approximates that well enough, you do find these nonlinear effects. If you don't, for reasons that should be explicit, then you shouldn't. That's the whole idea, right? You broke the assumptions, you should find a different result, and you do. So that's cool. So I think that that's where we're going, and it's right in both cases. It's just that we're measuring different things. Essentially, we have a different theory of what a city is. So
Right.
so that's that problem. But this leads to an interesting issue, since maybe we have a bit of an audience in India, which is what are these zones in Indian cities, for example? What are the commuting zones and what are the integrated cities? This is important because these integrated cities need governance, particularly for transportation planning and infrastructure planning. And they're basically integrated economic units. So when you talk about the GDP of Chennai, of Mumbai, of Delhi, you were really talking about these larger metropolitan urban areas. So it's interesting to think about what that is. And as India becomes more urbanized, what is the right form of governance? It should be a decision to be made in India, but in order to create the governance and infrastructure and so on for those units.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in work that we did on India, this was one of the struggles that we had was how do you define this notion of a
City.
functional city?
Exactly.
And of course, it must be said that the census has tried to approximate this using this notion of an urban agglomeration. But yes, I mean, I don't think it sort of is yet at a level where we can call that as the functional city.
So
In
that's a
any case,
wonderful problem for people in India to think about, or anywhere. I'd be happy to help. But cell phones allow you to do this to the extent there's good enough penetration of cell phones. That's what a lot of people are doing. We have a paper with colleagues at MIT that are pushing that point. But you can also, there are many ways to get at that. There are even ways to approximate. If you know more or less what people use for transportation, you can create these temporal zones for commuting that starts approximating that. But one of the things we struggle with, as Anand, was that a lot of the data in the census of India is not explicitly spatial. So we don't have the maps of population and socioeconomic quantities over space. As researchers, we kind of always trying to match this, but it's not very easy. And so in the future, I'm sure that will happen. But that's one of the challenges, for Indian statistics, is to do that better. That's happening everywhere because the technology and the concepts are happening like that everywhere. Technically, it's easier to do, but it's not been done quite yet.
right. So I just want to pick up something. You just briefly mentioned this. I just wanted you to speak a little bit more about this, which is sort of, this history or prehistory of urban scaling, right? I mean, these relationships that we're talking about are of the cities of today, right? These are the data that we're speaking about is cities across the world, but, over the last 50, 100 years. You and your colleagues have also done some work on looking at prehistoric settlements in the Americas. It'd be interesting to see what you found that was different and or unexpected, and or what you found that was the same. That suggests that there is something inherent about the network truths about these cities that you describe.
So this now gets us to history. So the story I always like to tell the story. Scott Ortman's a dear friend and colleague. He's now at University of Colorado Boulder. He was a postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute when I was developing some of this work, and so there was a group of us. And I was writing a paper about the theory, and one day he just came into my office and said, well, can you explain this to me? Explain what the model is, what the theory is, which is more or less what we talked about, interactions, two networks, and so on. And so when he said, well, you're talking about social interactions, talking about space, talking about road networks, I have them in my ancient cities. That's not about modern cities. It could be, but it could also be about he was looking at them at the time at pueblos in the southwest of the United States, which are smaller, low agricultural villages. But he also had some data on the Aztecs and the civilizations of the basin of Mexico, which today is where Mexico City is, but basically that has a long history of various American civilizations. And this had an interesting, not only was that, so he went on and started looking at that data with a few other colleagues in anthropology and archaeology. And what we had available in that data is mostly spatial. So it's the spatial part of these things. I'll get to that in a moment. But so this was kind of interesting because also there was sort of this this other picture in mind. There was a history of comparing American, so pre-Columbian American cities to old world cities, the cities of the Middle East and then in India and China and so on, and Europe. Because the idea is that the people that came to the Americas did not know about cities. They came before there were cities. Excuse me. And so that means they had to invent them separately. What's interesting is that there was this sort of comparative opportunity to look at the cities that developed in the Americas, in the New World, before the European contact, and the cities of the Old World, which of course had been in contact with each other. So it's thought the city started more or less in the Middle East and then expanded from there. But there was a sense there was contact there. So maybe the cities that came after in Europe or in East Asia and so on had been copies or adaptations. But in the Americas, that was not true. People had to invent cities independently. So the idea is by comparing, so as a mother, it's an historical experiment, right? The mother of all experiments. So that's what we did. We basically had data first on space, which had to do with, there was an excellent survey of the basin of Mexico that allowed us to estimate independently population and occupied area. So that was the first thing we did, just compare the scaling law for area. And then that was more or less as expected, but we had to work a little harder because we had a lot of very small settlements, so little villages. And those actually, when you do the theory, you can have an agglomeration of, say, you can imagine houses and so on without having a very explicit road network. If it's small, right? You just have a little smattering of houses and people can walk in between. And that has different exponents that are a little bit that you can calculate from theory. And so we saw that actually with a different exponent. And then we see the larger cities starting to behave like these 1 minus 1/6, the 5/6 scaling that we see now in modern cities. Now, of course, the technology is different. The largest city of that period is at the end, is Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztecs, becomes Mexico City later. But at the time of contact has about 200,000 people, which is very large for the 1500s, but it's much smaller than today's cities, right? And we have different technologies. But just so the baseline of area is different. These settlements tend to be denser, actually, because people are walking. But basically the relationship is the same. This percent increase is the same. So that was encouraging. And then, in a strike of genius, Scott and others started thinking, what do these people do with their socioeconomic capacity that we could observe? So it's interesting because they didn't have money explicitly, so we could not measure wealth kind of in the same way. And this is true of a lot of ancient civilizations. They didn't have money the way we have it today. And so one of the things we could look at were monuments. So whether they were actually built, so they had all these pyramids and things they built. So sure enough, the volume of monuments is superlinear. So presumably it's one of the things they did was to create a lot of monuments and a lot of infrastructure work. So you see that the things that have social value are superlinear in the way. So it's presumably because of interactions and so on. So that became sort of interesting. And then we moved on to other studies in other places. So by now we study many other civilizations. Scott studied Pueblo. We studied the Roman Empire with Jack Hansen, and that has many cities that allowed us to measure mostly spatial things again. And more recently, we've had some instances where there are measures of socioeconomic. So the Romans had coin and their coin hoards and a few things that can be measured. And so we're seeing not only the sort of city size effect that we find that the economy of larger cities are larger per capita, but also we're starting to find periods where there's economic growth, which is another effect on top. That means that the standard of living across these systems actually improved, not only in the large cities because they're bigger, but there's sort of a baseline improvement everywhere over time. For certain periods, it was more episodic than it is today. But we're starting to see all the characteristics that we come to understand not only in cities as structures, along what we talked about, but then the fact that new ideas, new institutions, and so on start creating essentially change throughout the system, the big cities and small cities, which is also a characteristic of urban systems and development. So that is also there. But this perspective basically allowed us to have empirical tools and diagnosis tools to look at data throughout history and see that these effects, with different technologies and institutions were there all along, maybe all the way to the first cities. And then we did another study, which we wanted to see a break, to see when is it that we can say we no longer had cities. So this is still work in progress, but we have a couple of papers on hunter-gatherers and hunter-gatherer camps. So these are people who are not settled; they're very small societies. Most of the data is ethnographic, so it's not people before there were cities in history. But what we find there is that most of these camps have different characteristics, and the interpretation from people who directly study it in anthropology, but also from other general considerations, is that people at that stage, which is a very stable period in human history, that before cities, people used to do this for hundreds of thousands of years, that people didn't have the social institutions to live at higher density and didn't have the infrastructure, but also didn't have the means of having energy density, so food density, in space that could sustain them so that they could stay in place. There are a few exceptions, like Pacific Northwest, people live off salmon and so on, which create little villages before agriculture. But really, so you needed to solve the energetic problem of having enough food for a city that keeps getting larger. And at the same time, you needed to create all the social institutions, particularly to do with conflict, and to emphasize cooperation such that the advantages of a city actually work. So a lot of conflict resolution in these societies is simple. People walk away and so on. Rates of violence actually turn out to be high. And so all those things, the things that we're still trying to solve, right? How to live with each other peacefully, how to cooperate, but also how to feed ourselves. So the same problems that people had back then, but there's a shift at some point where some of these things come together at the same time. So you have to solve both problems at the same time, deal with other people, store food, have enough food, and then you have cities. So it seems that really this is, in the language of physics, some of our audience may be like that. It seems like it really was a bit of a phase transition where modes of living and interaction, as well as modes of obtaining energy, had to change together. So it's a discontinuous thing. And then once that happened, you enter the scale invariant regime where you start producing cities of ever greater size as essentially the technologies change, but that these cities essentially have the same character, and that we see that in scaling relations. So it's very interesting.
Right. So, I mean, I guess this is kind of related. You sort of mentioned these various different sort of contexts that you study, how cities scale. You mentioned hunter-gatherers and, the Roman Empire, the Americas. I was just wondering, so when you think of city systems, right, let's take an extreme example of something like, say, the Soviet Union, right? Now, in the Soviet Union, city systems of nations evolve over time. And in some sense, when they sort of evolve based on flows of people, based on economic structure, based on technology, as you were mentioning. Now, in places, let's say, like Soviet Union or pre-1979 China, where there's a very sort of strong central diktat that sort of controls migration, economic activity, etc. So in some sense, it's sort of, the evolution of the city system within the Soviet Union was severely impacted by these sorts of restrictions. Now, in such, it's sort of a hypothetical, is in such a system, what would you expect would happen to, the network relationships that we would expect to see in, a city system that evolves quite differently?
Yeah, so we don't have direct data for the cases you brought up, partly because the governments of those places at those times probably didn't want to have a lot of evidence or didn't create it anyway. So I cannot be sure about what happened there. So it's a little conjectural. But there are things like more recently in China has had a system called the hukou system that controls migration. It's meant to control migration. And that was just that kind of the terms of that system has changed over time as Chinese policies try to incentivize or stop movements of people, particularly to cities. So we can talk a little bit about that case that we know a little bit more for. But in general, obviously, at different, and we also looked at medieval cities with that lens because there was a sense that medieval cities were much more structured by guild, which, by caste, and so on, and that the interactions were less fluid, generalized. But we didn't find much of a signature actually in that case. But that deviated from these general patterns. But in general, in all those cases, what's happening is that there's sort of an effort to limit through planning, actually, the number of settlements and their size, and also inside each settlement, how people interact with each other. So this comes in a variety of ways. So the Soviets, for example, built a lot of industrial cities dedicated to just a single industry. And while that single industry was viable economically, which is partly in the plan system, that kept going and employed a lot of people and so on, it created something that looked sort of like a city, was very specialized. And when those restrictions or that system kind of went down for various reasons, then a lot of these cities, particularly small and very specialized cities, kind of disappeared. Whereas Moscow is still there, right? And St. Petersburg is still there as older cities, and that, by and large, doing well. So there's that. The specialized city that's very it's sort of unnatural. It can live if it has a strong export sector. A lot of countries that go through a very strong industrial phase have cities like that, either created intentionally or not. The United States had it, Britain had it, China has it, has them, Soviet Union has it, etc. So those cities are usually in trouble the moment that sector or that industry becomes obsolete, or there's some change in the system that they cannot export anymore, and so on. So one of the things that China needs to watch out for is what happens now, right, with less globalization and fast economic change. Some of its industries are adapting, but some of the old style industries are already creating sort of rust belt cities. But you also see that the cities that kind of entered periods of trouble, economic trouble and then demographic trouble in the United States, just decided the election, right? So these cities used to be on the left politically and now are not, because people are mad, right? Anyway, just to say that. So that is happening, and it's interesting. But then, so going to an example of China is somewhat interesting, because what emerges something in between. So sort of the strength of being a city, in the sense we've been talking about, is still there, but it's somewhat limited. So, for example, when you look at cities in China, China's the same population as India, more or less. India is now slightly bigger, but it's 1.4 billion people, more or less. And so the biggest city in China is 20-some million, Shanghai, Beijing, and so on. So that's not very big for a population that big. It's almost like the United States with a population that's a quarter. So that tells you something already, that, it's just a rule of thumb, but it tells you that somehow the cities of China, the large cities of China, could be much larger, but they're not. So, and part of what happened there is that this immigration system has always constrained people from coming. People that don't have the right hukou, that basically rural dwellers by classification, cannot come to large cities. And as a result, there are a lot of people that maybe would want to come to large cities that didn't. At some point, this has now changed. The system is more liberalized. You see the large cities now grow a little bit faster, but of course, demographics of China slow down. But what you see is that what was estimated is that as much as a quarter of the population in the large cities of China were there sort of semi-illegally. They didn't have the right hukou, which means that people cannot have education for the kids, or healthcare, or a few other social benefits, which of course then people didn't bring their kids. It was kind of complicated. But anyway, that's getting a little bit more normal in China, maybe, as urbanization is seen as a way to further development. But that tells you that this creates a lot of limitations in terms of what kind of urban system you end up with. But at the same time, the character of these cities is as expected. The larger cities are more productive, they have larger economies, they're changing. The nature of the economy is faster to become more service and innovation oriented and all these other things. So you see these mixed systems. In the Soviet Union, it would be a lovely thing Soviet Union, now Russia, and it would be a lovely thing to measure better, because essentially, it was a very planned system at the time where the Soviet Union urbanized and industrialized, and post Soviet Union, you now have large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, who are modern cities, but you have also a lot of places that are less developed, and definitely because there's a whole context of population decrease. There's strong population change, but you still have urbanization, a bit like Japan, different case. But you have population loss, but you still have urbanization, that younger people are coming to cities. So that's a new stage. We've never seen quite this before. It's very interesting to think what will happen in these nations.
There's a number of things that we wanted to discuss, get into a little bit more about, innovation and income, somewhat more on the socioeconomic aspects of scaling. But maybe we leave that for another conversation. Hopefully we'll have you back. But just to sort of wrap this up, one of the questions that maybe it's a bit provocative, but okay, so we understand these relationships. We know that these patterns are observed across nations, urban systems around the world. We know that there is a science now that underlies why these patterns exist. The question is, what do we do with this? We live in an urban world. All our problems are urban. What can a science of cities do that helps us resolve some of those big issues that confront us today?
Yeah, we could spend hours on that one. I think that the role of science is to give us knowledge that extrapolates, that can go to different situations for which we haven't seen before. There are other practical things you can do with science, but that's important, that we can foresee what cities in the future might be as technologies change, as they get bigger or smaller, as they age. There are many of these trends that are important, right? And the climate change and so on. So some of these are bigger things like demographic change and aging, because populations will be reduced and entire urban systems will change their character. India's not going through this yet, but Anand and I were just starting to look at this, and actually demographic change is coming very quickly to India as well. But you see anticipations in Japan, in Europe, and parts of the US and China. So those are just examples, but I think the general lessons about planning, which is, so here are just a few. One is that these rates of socioeconomic outputs, both of good things and bad things, are sort of explosive, are superlinear. So that means that to control the bad things, you need to put a superlinear effort. So you need to actually have an effort more than proportional to population. And then inside cities, even the densest parts where there's more interactions, they actually need a lot of regulation in order to stay safe, to be repaired in terms of infrastructure and uses of space and so on. And I think planners have not had that notion that some things, require disproportionate effort to what's going on and so on, and that these systems are connected. The connected thing in terms of dynamics is that because cities have a life of their own, a lot of what successful planning is not actually in getting some policy or solution done, control from the top down, but have the possibilities really to create what I like to call vicious and virtuous cycles. So virtuous cycles mostly, that if you create certain changes in the built environment or certain changes in sort of safety or the ability of people to interact, this has a lot of consequences. It creates economic growth, it creates better well-being, it creates better health, it creates people that are happier, and this creates better prices, real estate goes up, the city collects taxes. There's a lot of virtuous cycle. So cities are often in this position, I sometimes like to call it arbitrage, that by creating better social conditions, better conditions for people to interact, they can create, again, superlinear effects, more than direct results from their investments in terms of all the things that are produced by such societies. This usually in most cities come through real estate taxes and a few other things, but also go through reductions in violence, better rates, better, healthier people that correspond to less spending on certain things, and a bunch of other things that make life easier. So you have to understand that these systems are all connected. And while you intervene, you kind of intervening in all these things. So it's a bit like policy is less like, I passed the law and it's done. It's more like staying in the loop, more like gardening, right? You keep on going and you're seeing the effects, you're kind of correcting and so on. But you can actually use these ideas to have policies of development that are much more inclusive, that are much more systemic, and that produce results over the really long term. And that's, I think, very important. It's very different from the way we think about economic development or human development. And then, there are things like we're doing a lot of work with cities that are still in transition, they're still building their infrastructure. Cities of India are kind of doing this fast, but, for example, I'm doing a lot of work with cities in Africa. They're just building the infrastructure. There's a lot of informality. So the cities are being assembled organically almost. But what you find is these basically mismatches between the two main networks. So in cities that are very informal, you have settlements, so people are there, but they're limited in their interactions and opportunities, partly because the physical city is not there and the legal city is not there. So people cannot interact because they cannot move around. They don't have services, so they spend a lot of time surviving. And they don't often have a legal status that enables them to have a job or, go to school and so on. So this is kind of like, how do you assemble the networks that allow a city to function? And that means that development is a really physical thing. It's a socioeconomic thing, but it's also a physical thing. And even as a socioeconomic thing, it has signatures that are kind of very tangible in terms of how connected people are, what functions they have access to, and so on, rather than sort of a general thing that you have innovation or institutions and life just blossoms. You can sort of understand the mechanics of it by using these ideas of cities as various networks that need to work together. So out of that, you can come up with lots of examples, but basically that, I think, completely changes the perspective of what these economic processes are and what the physical and network infrastructures that they require.
Thank you so much, Luis. Really, appreciate your time. I'm certainly hoping that, further down the line, we can bring you back and get into the weeds on some of these things we didn't even touch upon, for instance, on climate change. That would be a good thing to talk about next time. But for now,
Great.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Okay. Take care, guys.